Lots of firsts occurred during the pandemic. Among them, the first time the Federal Emergency Management Agency used its disaster relief fund to respond to a nationwide public health emergency. FEMA used the funds to cover the cost of vaccinations and testing sites, among other things. The Government Accountability Office has found FEMA may have underestimated just how much would be required. For more, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke to the GAO's Director of Homeland Security and Justice Issues, Currie.
The COVID-19 pandemic, surprising in a number of ways. I think most people are surprised to even know that FEMA was involved in the response because they think of hurricanes and natural disasters. But FEMA has a large fund of money that's very flexible to use in the case of emergencies. And so it was definitely tapped into in the COVID-19 pandemic. So one of the things that the appropriations committees wanted us to look at is just seeing how large the costs we're getting out of the pandemic for FEMA. They wanted us to look at the effect on the disaster relief fund long term, and also just how good of a job FEMA was doing in anticipating some of these costs. And as you set up, they blew well past their initial estimates. Initial estimates right out of the bat, which understandably were, there wasn't as much information, were around $20 billion. And FEMA now estimates it's going to spend about $171 billion by the end of fiscal year 2026.
It was just crazy time for all of us. Was that lack of knowledge just due to the fact that nothing had ever happened like this before, A, and B, FEMA had never had to deal with anything like this before?
It is true. I mean, it's impossible to see the future. No one had a crystal ball in 2020 to see how big of a problem this was going to be and how much it was going to cost. But I think that there were a number of places as the pandemic wore on where estimates probably could have been a little bit more realistic and accurate. FEMA sort of re-baselined their estimates at different stages, and at each point they underestimated what it was going to cost. For example, in 2021, the president authorized basically FEMA to cover 100% of costs. Usually with its programs, they cover 75%, the state or the local governments cover 25%. It went to 100%. So at that point, I think it was reasonable to expect that states were going to start sending in a lot more projects and requests, just given that it's going to be 100% federally funded. And so all along, they just continue to underestimate the cost.
Yeah, is this sort of thing it's never used this for a public health emergency, but has it used the DRF funds for other other disasters where certain things were required, such as, personal protective gear and things of that nature, or, even just setting up sites? It's all very similar to what FEMA does for other disasters, right?
You're right. You make a good point, because a lot of what FEMA was doing is providing equipment and logistical capability to get equipment to different places and to get things where they needed to be, which is what FEMA does in a disaster. So while the pandemic, the scale of it was unprecedented, 59 individual disaster declarations, the operation was not unforeseen or unprecedented. And this is a really important point we were trying to get across to FEMA, and they didn't really agree with us on. But, their response to our findings and our recommendation was that they don't expect to have to respond to a pandemic like this again. And they don't expect to be asked to do something like this again, which that could be true. None of us know. But what the point we were making is there are a number of different scenarios, whether it's a cyber attack, whether it's a wide-scale multi-state disaster, whether it's multiple concurrent disasters in different states across the whole country. There's a number of scenarios where they are going to have to manage a huge response and recovery operation that potentially is going to be very, very difficult to estimate. So that's the reason we actually recommended that they do a better job of trying to develop these estimates rather than just trying to forget the pandemic and move on with business as usual.
We're speaking with Currie. He is the Director of Homeland Security and Justice Issues with the Government Accountability Office. Yeah, so what's at stake here of not getting those estimates right? Where does the DRF currently stand? Because FEMA is still obligated to spend some, mostly unfortunately, funeral funds towards this disaster declaration. What is going to happen if these estimates aren't as accurate as they could be?
It's a big problem. Right now, today, FEMA estimates there's going to be a $6 billion shortfall in the disaster relief fund by the end of September. And remember, that is also with almost a $35 billion appropriation earlier this year for the fiscal year 24 appropriations bill. So the DRF was replenished, and that quickly it's back going to be in the red. And they're likely to get another annual appropriation which will help a little bit. But what the COVID-19 pandemic has done to FEMA is it's essentially put it in a position where it's going to be behind all the time with the DRF. And of course, it's going to need supplemental appropriations from here on out. Now, that's just with what we know today. I mean, just if we have another 2017, for example, where we have 3 huge concurrent disasters and wildfires, that's only going to exacerbate the problem and going to require that much more in supplemental appropriations. Also, remember, this fund is used for recovery projects for disasters going back 20 years. Hurricane Katrina is still an open disaster. They're still obligating dollars for infrastructure projects. So if there's no money in the disaster relief fund, then those past recoveries are sort of paused. That's what FEMA did last year. And they do that so they can respond to things happening immediately today, but it's not sustainable for the long term.
Yeah, long term, I mean, is there maybe an over-reliance on the fact that they're always going to get that supplemental funding? Because, you know, there is nothing more direct to or of government services to citizens than disaster response. So it is always something that gets front and center as soon as something happens. Do you sense there may be an over-reliance on that factor rather than, you know, planning for long term when it comes to disaster relief spending?
Well, there is a reliance on supplemental spending. Congress caps the amount FEMA can get in the regular annual appropriation for the DRF. And so what that basically says is that if anything large happens in the country that year, you're going to need a supplemental. And so most of FEMA's funding over the last 20 years has been in supplemental appropriations. It's a massive amount. I mean, if you look back to 2017, they've spent over $250 billion on disasters, which is just a huge amount. That's, 6 times DHS's annual budget. So what COVID did was it made this problem worse. And so it used to be where maybe they'd get behind toward the end of the fiscal year and then it would get replenished. Now seems like they're behind multiple points of time in the fiscal year, which, if you think about it, this requires Congress several times a year to try to add funding or attach funding to different bills, which requires those to get passed. And that's, that can be difficult sometimes.
So as you mentioned, nobody can tell the future. What can be done to actually get some long-term planning in some fiscal solvency for the DRF?
We'd just like to see more realistic estimates at different stages early on in the disaster and a different way of doing this. And so in month 1 after a disaster, it's really difficult. All right. I mean, if you have a huge hurricane, maybe you don't know if it's going to cost you $10 billion, if it's going to cost you $50 billion yet. But in month 6, the picture is starting to develop. You know what projects are going to, come into play. You know how long it's going to take. We want to see more accurate estimation quickly. And that way, Congress and the appropriations committees can then forecast out what they're likely going to need to appropriate in the future.
Chris Currie, Director for Homeland Security and Justice Issues at the Government Accountability Office, speaking with Federal News Network's Eric White. Find this interview along with a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive.